Welcome back. So, greetings. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Tom Zeller. I am KSJ class of 2014. I don't know if any of my folks are still here. There you are. Hey. And I am the editor-in-chief of Undark. It's a digital science magazine that Deb Blum and I conceived on what now seems like a whim 7 years ago. If I could say one thing about it, it would probably be that we did not know what the heck we were doing when we started. But I think there's one thing that we knew we weren't doing, and that was launching a magazine that was concerned with what I described then and still do as gee whiz coverage of science. And it's not that science isn't gee whiz. I think we've all kind of walked around the MIT campus these last couple days, and even at the museum that many of us were at last night, and all sort of felt a sense of gee whiz. It happens. But given that we were taking as our namesake Undark, which many of you already know was a early 20th century radium-based paint that's simultaneously glowed with the promise of science, but also in the end proved deadly. And given that, we knew that we wanted to cover science as a fundamentally human endeavor, full of curiosity and wonder and great feats of achievement, but also one of failures, ambitions, biases, and even, as we all know, sometimes real human harm. And I think that approach to science journalism, as we've been hearing over and over since we've been here, is more important now than ever. And it's also in the very DNA of this project, long division. And I have to say that in 7 years of publishing Undark, I've really never been prouder to have something appear at Undark. And I can't really take much credit for that, except to say that I knew to step aside and give room to the visionary journalists that you see here and others who actually put it together. And I'm going to step aside again and kick it over to Ashley Smart, the chief visionary, the associate director of the Night Science Journalism program, and also a KSJ alum himself. Ashley.
As Pam Belloc saying, I've been called a lot of things in my life, but never a chief visionary until now. Thank you, Tom. So about this time last year, my boss, Deborah Blum, came to me with an idea. It had been about 2 years since George Floyd had been murdered by a police officer in Minneapolis. It had been almost 3 years since the New York Times had launched the 1619 Project, which had challenged Americans to reconsider the role of slavery in the country's history. And everyone was talking about race, almost everyone. What Deborah observed, rightfully I think, was that amid all the discussion of race, there was very little discussion of the role that science had to play in all of it, dating back to the 18th century naturalists and beyond, but also up to the present, when many people, including in mainstream science, still perpetuate harmful ideas about race. And so the Long Division Project was born, a collection of features, essays, multimedia reporting that tells a story not just of race in the narrow sense, but of the ways that science has and continues to categorize humanity, sometimes producing meaningful insights, often engendering horrific harms. It's a story that intersects in some way with virtually every aspect of modern life, health and medicine, education, criminal justice. And it is a story that we felt science had yet to fully reckon with. And so we picked the brains of some of the best scholars we could find. We assembled some of the best writers we could find, and some of the best editors we could find, and some of the best fact checkers we could find. And I'm proud to say that the resulting package published in Undark Magazine was a National Magazine Award Finalist. I'm even prouder to say that it has sparked discussions in university classrooms and in research laboratories. I'm proud to be able to say that it's informed conversations at places like the National Institutes of Health. And I'm very proud and very honored to have with us today 4 of the people who are instrumental in making that project a success. And they are on the panel today. Alan Goodman is a professor of biological anthropology at Hampshire College, where he teaches and writes on the health and nutritional consequences of poverty, inequality, and racism. Alan is the editor or author of a variety of books, including most recently Racism, Not Race, with Joseph Graves. And he was one of the first people we called when we were brainstorming this idea about the Long Division Project. Welcome, Alan. Jyoti Madhusoodanan was a 2021 Knight Science Journalism Project Fellow and has written for the likes of Nature, Scientific American, and the New York Times. Her reporting on clinical trials and health inequities has received support from the Association of Healthcare Journalists and from the Alicia Patterson Foundation, and she contributed a really outstanding feature to the Long Division Project on how race has influenced breast cancer research. Brandon Obunu is an assistant professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at Yale University, an external professor at the Santa Fe Institute, and also currently an MLK scholar here at MIT. He has been described as a radical collaborator, and in addition to his work as a computational biologist, he runs a parallel research program at the intersection of science, society, and culture. His essay for the Long Division Project looked critically at how we reckon with revelations of racism in science. And last but certainly not least, Angela Saini was a 2013 Knight Science Journalism Fellow and has authored 4 books, including Superior, The Return of Race Science, which was a finalist for the LA Times Book Prize. And her latest book is The Patriarchs. Angela contributed 2 pieces to the Long Division Project, a photo essay on the problematic displays at the American Museum of Natural History, and an investigation that looked at how race science persists in academic publishing. And Angela was also co-editor of the Long Division Project. So I want to welcome all of our panelists, and I want to go ahead and dive in and start things off with you, Alan. I want to give each of you a chance to kind of dig in on some of the issues that were relevant to the Long Division Project. And Alan, is one of the scholars who lended us wisdom early on in the series. And as the author of the book Racism, Not Race, with Joe Graves, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on the differences between racism and race, and how you think about the question of what race is and what race is not.
Thank you. I assume my microphone is on and everybody can hear me. Thank you, Tom, wherever you are. Ashley, especially, thank you, and it's really a pleasure to be back here. This is exciting to be talking to journalists. As a presumptive senior member of this panel, I am going to start with a brief synopsis of efforts to clarify what race is and isn't, and particularly why publics are, and maybe all of us, sometimes are so dazed and confused about the relationship between the idea of race and, on one hand, human biogenetic variation, and on the other, racism. I think language is part of the problem, and I'm going to talk a bit about language, but really it's power of ideas that I think are the deeper problem. So that's part of what I want to highlight. So what is race? Race is a thing, a noun, but it's a sort of provisional thing. Since at least Frederick Douglass, skeptics of the idea that humans have biological races, separate and unequal, they've wrestled with what are the right words to express their skepticism. And in fact, until the evolutionary synthesis of the 1930s that brought us concepts like population and genetic drift, there really was no good way to talk about human global genetic variation in a non-racial language. The first person to really do so, Ashley Montague, responded flatly, just rejecting race as a biological reality and declaring in 1940 race is a myth. But of course, social race is real, and if race is a myth, it remains a pretty damn powerful one. Many writers today put race in scare quotes to signify doubt or to distance themselves from this notion, but that practice, I'd say, simply avoids making clear what race is and isn't. So, some provisional solutions. The problem is, of course, is that race has two distinct meanings, biological and socio-historical. My co-author, Joseph Graves, always qualifies race with the modifiers social or biological, social race or biological race, and I think that's great. However, it is confusing because it doesn't explain why humans do not have biological races, yet some species do. In one meaning, the social seems to be valid and the other, biological, is not. Me, I've tried to qualify race with the idea of, sorry to use quotes, the idea of race. And my hope is to highlight that race derives from and is reified through socio-politically relevant history, not nature. But always saying the idea of race is cumbersome and probably a bit too academic for a general audience. So finally, kind of giving up post-George Floyd, you know, Joe Graves and I titled, as Ashley mentioned, our 2021 book, Racism, Not Race. And I like that title. I still like that title 2 years later. The title aims to foreground that processes, differences in lived experience and racism explain variation in health, wealth, and pretty much everything that varies by race. Race is a noun and a counting device, not a verb and process. Racism, however, is a process. So these are examples. My question is, how do we best talk about and write clearly and accessibly about what race is and how it relates to those polar concepts of racism and human genetic variation? To give just one little piece about how hard it is for me, my students have the aha moment in understanding the difference between race and genetic variation when I have them as a captive audience for 14 weeks in a class. But then I ask them to go home during Thanksgiving break and explain it to their grandmothers, and invariably they come back and say, I couldn't do it. So there's an issue of kind of how it trickles down. So ideology and power are under race. A quick thought experiment. Compare for a moment public perceptions of global warming or climate crisis versus human biogenetic variation. Global warming, everybody says, yeah, crisis, the crisis of global warming, whereas understanding biogenetic variation is not a crisis. Second, geoscience types complained for years that publics can't see climate crisis, and that's why it's so hard to come to believe that it's real. In response, in the last decade, well-funded documentaries, think Al Gore, and public education think tanks have turned us all to believing that what we couldn't see. Who has not seen a graph of rising CO2 levels, temperatures, or ice caps melt, or polar bears on ice floes? Compare that for a moment to the idea about race and difference. We think we see race. Race is obvious, sort of the opposite issue of global warming. Our culture trains our eyes to see race. We live, in fact, in racial smog. So changing minds that race is a terrible shorthand for biological variation is way more difficult, and I'll posit 3 reasons and then stop. First, there are few documentaries and well-funded public education initiatives. Thank you, Undark, for coming into that. Second, instead of the challenge of making believe something you can't see, we have the more difficult task of explaining why something we thought it to be real is both not real in one way, biological, and real in another, social. And that's a lot of work for one word to do, and I can say more about that. Finally, racist biology is far more embedded. Dismantling this idea is hugely disruptive to the status quo. And I think we're actually seeing a lot of that consternation now. So to end, in my humble opinion, if we can clearly communicate what we know about human differences and the impact of racism, we'll have a much better chance of working together to fight those other existential threats like rising fascism, income inequality, and climate crisis. And so I'm so glad for everybody who's making an effort to try to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. And I think there's a ton we could talk about the conflation of race and genetic variation and biological variation. And Jyoti, you touched, that came into play in a piece that you wrote for the series, a really nuanced look at the role of race in breast cancer research. Can you talk a little bit about that feature and about the lessons you take away from it?
Thanks, Ashley, and thank you to everyone at Undark really for putting that together and giving us the space to talk about these issues that come up so often when reporting on race. Building a little bit off of what Alan just spoke about, this racial smog that we all live in, it came up while reporting this story. So when I started reporting this piece for Long Division about breast cancer research in the US, one of the sources I spoke with early on is an epidemiologist named Erica Warner, who kind of clarified for me that science has really contributed to the health disparities that we see today in two ways. One, by using race as a biological category, as a mathematical variable in research and so on, but also by overlooking the effects of systemic racism. And both of those forces have impacted the health outcomes that we see today. So if you look at the stats today, and it's almost, you'll see this line thrown around quite a bit, that the incidence of breast cancer is higher in white women, but the death rates are higher in Black women. Black women are 40% more likely to die of breast cancer. They're also diagnosed at later stages and with more aggressive forms of the disease. And that's just the state of the landscape today. But if you look way back at the earliest efforts to understand this disease at the turn of the last century, when people were really asking, what is breast cancer? Who gets it? Who needs to worry about this? A lot of that work was divided by race from the start. Incidence was documented in terms of women of one race versus the other. And even back then, or maybe especially back then, because at the time, we're talking about research that was being done during a time of segregation. So especially back then, breast cancer is seen as a white person's disease. And race is embedded in scientific thinking from the start. And it kind of stays there as people study the disease more and more. And somehow in the US, over time, the statistic that Black women have a slightly lower incidence, it gets distorted into this narrative of Black women don't need to worry about breast cancer as much. And that starts getting enmeshed in medical practice. So this idea continues, and it filters through when one of the people I spoke with for the story, she went to her doctor, asked for a mammogram, and she was told, you don't need to get a mammogram because Black women don't need to worry about breast cancer. And it comes up again when scientific advances make their way into medical practice. When mammograms are first introduced, when tamoxifen is introduced, which is really, they make these dramatic changes in who gets to live and who gets to die. All of those interventions are targeted at white women because breast cancer is seen as a white woman's disease. And one of the instances that really stood out to me while reporting was the one about genetic variation. Because back in the 1990s, when researchers first discovered the BRCA mutations, which are mutations in two genes called BRCA1 and BRCA2, people who have certain versions of these genes are at higher risk of getting breast cancer. These genes were initially identified in particular families with a strong history of cancer. And the rates at which these mutations occur were never systematically studied by racial groups. So no one really looked at, do they occur in Black women? over a large population-based study or anything like that. But without that evidence, somehow this idea that Black women don't have these mutations and don't need to be screened for them, it starts getting circulated. And it kept coming up when I spoke with sources for the piece. It seemed like it was very word of mouth how it happened. There wasn't a scientific study saying, no, they don't have this gene. But somehow the absence of evidence from this population is used as evidence of low risk. And eventually, about a decade later, people start studying this question to see if it's actually true. And big surprise, they find it's not true. And everyone has about equal genetic risks, more or less, and needs to be screened. And this idea comes up again and again through the story of breast cancer, that science that uses race in these flawed ways ends up contributing to racism in how medical advances help people in the broader world. And it's something that I think about a lot as I'm reporting on these statistics of today in terms of racial disparities. When we see that incidence is higher in white women and mortality is higher in Black women, et cetera, those are the numbers today. But I think it's valuable for us as writers to sort of consider this long arc of research that has contributed to those disparities, partly because science is a continuum. Today's science builds on yesterday's science, but also just as a way of acknowledging that the health disparities that we see today, they're not just a product of racism in society, they're a product of how science was done in the past. Thank you.
Brandon, in your piece, you took on one of the titans of science, of biology, E.O. Wilson. Beloved scientist who did transformative work in sociobiology, but who also was revealed to have lended his support and clout and friendship to one of the most notorious race scientists of recent history, Phil Rushton. And you wrote about how the science community sometimes seems at a loss for how to respond when those revelations are unearthed. Can you talk a little bit about how you approach that issue in your piece and what you were trying to accomplish?
Yeah, yes, thank you, first of all. This is really quite a thrill and an honor to have participated in something this ambitious. And I think one of the things I've learned really from you all, from my experience just as a reader and a consumer of science media, is that writers are oftentimes motivated by attention between two things. It's kind of like there's selfishness and there's generosity in everything that you do in writing. Meaning it has to be important to you, you have to care about it and be passionate about it, and it has to kind of resonate with you personally in some sort of way, or professionally, or both. But then there has to be a shift where you actually want to take that messaging and that thought and that experience and share that with others, because you recognize that you're not the only person who feels that way. And I think this project was that experience really quite on the nose, right? So when I think about the selfish side of it, I think the first component to how I think about race and race science is really about my identity as a Black man in America. And I think that one has been articulated by geniuses for centuries in this country. So I don't really even need to explain that one, right? So that one's, but I think it is my professional craft as a population geneticist who actually thinks deeply about these issues from a technical perspective, like the things that influence breast cancer risk. And the way I describe it, and I've described it in the article, race science is the greatest scam, intellectual scam maybe we've ever come up with. And it has completely ruined my profession, right? And so I have this deep kind of vendetta against it, both because of, again, what it's done for me personally and my community personally, but how difficult it's made my job, okay? And so this is the kind of tension that I enter this issue with. This is how I kind of thought about this issue, and I thought about it through the years, and that kind of motivated me to participate. But I think specifically in terms of the intellectual dimension of what, and the specific ideas that I contributed, because that was kind of the spiritual entry point to this, but the specific issues had to do with watching us all continuously fumble through these experiences where we learn things or we're reflecting on things about people luminaries in various fields who have these racist pasts, and how cumbersome, right, the conversations are. And it's not, now, sometimes some things have to be clumsy because they're just that way, but we weren't learning anything. We were kind of reinventing the wheel after every single incident, and the incidents kind of, followed this, like they followed this theme every single time we had one of these public hiccups about race. So I said, I think it was that frustration that I wanted to clarify for myself, but again, for my colleagues. And I think Edward Osborne Wilson was kind of one of the most recent examples of this. Ended up being kind of an effective character to have a conversation about how we think about problematic people from our past, in part because he was so beloved, right, in all of these ways by all of these people, myself included, okay, right? And I think this is a person who had a very big impact on my trajectory as a person who does basic science and yet writes about it and thinks about it. Now, I've disagreed with a lot of his opinions for many, many years, but it was this revelation about his adjacency to race science that I think kind of, I think required more elaboration. But I think what really, so these are kind of building what my motivations were. I think when this happened, I knew something needed to be said. I think the maybe surprising part about what got me inspired to participate in this project, look, Angela had taken on race science already, right? We had already known, like, that one's been written about beautifully and well. That takedown has happened, right? So I know what race scientists have been thinking and what they've been doing. Frankly, it was how, it was imprecision and clumsiness from my friends, from people who I was politically aligned with, right? From people who I agreed with on the issue, and who were falling victim to these traps, right? And when I saw that happening over and over and over again, right, getting sucked into the debate about whether or not the person themselves was a nice or mean person, for example, right? You see this happen over and over and over and over again, and where you go is then you have a legion of people saying, well, oh, the person's really, really nice, and they helped me. And there's oftentimes a person of color, well, the person didn't do anything to me. Like, you would see this happen over and over and over again, and I'm like, that's really not the point about the conversation we're supposed to be having about what was done here. So I looked at the E.O. Wilson situation as an example where I could kind of think about this more carefully. And so with that, I said, okay, maybe I can offer something of an algorithm. Algorithm's a little bit of a scary word for a lot of us, for a lot of good reasons. But the idea is just a heuristic or something that we can use to think through these things, both things that have already happened and new things that can happen in the future. And that's what I attempted to do, again, for myself, but I wanted to offer that for my colleagues. And I enjoyed the process working with this team. This is the best editors I've ever worked with. And I think with their help, hopefully I was able to, take a few steps towards being able to offer us just that. Thank you.
You took more than a few steps, Brandon. It was a great essay. Angela, you also wrote a tremendous essay for the project that was eye-opening for me because, one, you talked about kind of the persistence of race science today, even in mainstream academic journals. Not just race science, race pseudoscience still kind of permeating in the mainstream academic publishing world. But you also kind of beautifully showed how a lot of it traces back to one journal, the Mankind Quarterly, and to one person in particular, Wycliffe Draper, who really kind of used his philanthropic might to kind of push this idea that's still kind of with the community today. Can you talk a little bit about that piece and maybe what it illustrates or illuminates about why this, race pseudoscience is still so prominent with us today?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and I agree with everyone that working with the Undark team was such an honor and a pleasure, a really professional team of people, and astounding for me as someone, and I don't want to put the UK down, but the standards were very, very high. The team was just excellent. It's wonderful to be here as well, back at MIT. During my fellowship year, I was pregnant, which means that I am 10 in fellowship years, but my son is also 10 in human years, and that's how I measure how much time has passed. And it's wonderful to have some of those fellows from that cohort here, Karen, Heather, Eli, and Cynthia. It's just wonderful to see you, because they were like my family for that year when my husband wasn't around while I was pregnant. So we often think of racism in science and academia as either being inadvertent, a kind of product of unconscious bias, or a legacy of history, that there was racism in the past and now we're living with the effects of it. And what I was keen to stress for my contribution to this amazing package was that there are deliberate, politically motivated individuals within academia who are racist themselves, white supremacists themselves, who are still trying to push this idea that race is biologically meaningful and that there's some kind of hierarchy between races through the academic process, including publishing. So within publishing today, we have journals that are still publishing pseudoscience. Sometimes that gets caught, sometimes it doesn't. And there are individuals in universities all over the world who are out and out white supremacists. And for whatever reason, because of tenure or because of academic freedom or freedom of speech, it's very hard to get rid of them. And so the way I did this was by looking at why have we created an ecosystem in which they are able to exist. And part of the reason for that is this story of Wycliffe Draper, who from the early 20th century onwards, he was a very wealthy heir to a textile fortune, and he decided to use his inheritance to fund scientific racism right throughout the 20th century. And a lot of beautiful journalism has been done on that throughout the 20th century, not least the funding of scientific racism by the brilliant scholar William H. Tucker, who passed away recently. So I wanted to bring that up to date. Here was this individual who was crucial to the survival of scientific racism through the second half of the 20th century. And part of the way that he did that was to fund many of the biggest scientific racists of his time, including Philippe Rushton, who E.O. Wilson had very close connections with, and also funding the Mankind Quarterly, which was this pseudoscientific journal that appeared after the Second World War as a vehicle for these very extreme ideas. The Mankind Quarterly is still in publication today, and the reason for that is because of his lavish funding for all those decades. And even though many of the people who used to write for it have passed away, there is a new crop of people who have replaced them. So much of my piece was about this new crop of people, the ways in which they survive on the editorial boards of journals of some of the biggest publishing companies in the world, including Elsevier and Sage. And why is it that these people are able to survive within these institutions unchecked and, despite whatever vigilance there is supposed to be or standards there are supposed to be, how they manage to keep on? Their arguments, their scientific arguments, hold very little weight now, of course. It's very difficult to make this claim that there is some biological hierarchy between races. But what they exploit is this argument around academic freedom. And of course, all of us have a commitment to academic freedom and freedom of speech. Why do we not have more of an argument about, shouldn't there also be standards around that? Does academic freedom mean you can just say whatever you want, whether it's true or not, and just get away with it? And I think that's the frontier that I think many of us as science journalists have to grapple with now, because that's what those on the very extreme right who are pushing misinformation, disinformation online in quite devastating ways. We only have to see the political ramifications. We can see them everywhere now. People like Steve Bannon rely on this. Many of the mass shootings that have happened recently, their manifestos have cited this material. So it's really on us now, and that was what Ashley's piece was about the Buffalo shooting and how much of this scientific racism was cited in that. We are that layer of vigilance that is needed within academia and publishing to make sure that these people are held to account, that they can't get away with what they're doing. And that's why our work, I think, matters just as much as it ever did. This is as much as a problem now as it was in the 1960s. Thank you.
Brandon, when you were speaking, you mentioned that you saw your colleagues and your friends falling into traps. I want to put this question to the panel, and perhaps Brandon and Alan will have different perspectives on it than Jyoti and Angela. But are there traps that you see journalists falling into when they cover or write about race, and what are some of those?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're similar, right? To some of the traps we talked about here. I mean, I think you know, not unlike any polarized debate, right? I think a good journalist will attempt to kind of recapitulate what the shape of the debate is, and I think these conflicts when it comes to these characters. It's always responsible to kind of, tell the audience, tell the reader, exactly what is actually at stake here. What is the complaints? We saw this. I mentioned a lot of examples of this that have happened with scientific figures and James Webb and all these other a lot of eugenicists that have been kind of unmasked recently. But I think, I think this trap of, I present this dichotomy in my article about kind of who the person is versus what they did, right? And I've seen a lot of journalists fall into that trap as well, right? And I think the conversation is often about this battle for the public narrative about the soul of this person, right? Whether or not this is a person that needs to be forgiven or not, or whether, and then you get into like a cultural relativism thing, and that and ends up spiraling into a conversation about whether or not they're a person of their time, and of course you have a big distraction. I think journalists, I've seen that happen a lot in the coverage of Edward Osborne Wilson. I think alternatively, kind of what I've offered, and I have also seen done well under certain circumstances, really is just focusing on the damage that has been done by the individual to their field, to communities, and kind of what are the ways that we can kind of what does reconciliation really look like as a practical thing for communities? How do we actually rebuild a science that is better rather than simply pulling names off of things, right? Which is this symbolic gesture that has kind of dominated a lot of the conversation, even in the journalistic space. So I think some of the problems are similar to what we've seen kind of in the scientific discourse, where it's oftentimes about the person, which makes for splashy stories and kind of contentious and interesting debates, but oftentimes miss the point.
Thank you, Brendan. So, I mean, I think the trap that everybody falls into is not really defining what they mean by race, and that was sort of similar to my talk. And just to say, my work as an biological anthropologist has always been about kind of the intermixing of biology and culture, but here's really one place where I think we need to kind of pull them apart for a while, or maybe a long while, because if you don't, and you just say, oh, there's a racial difference in breast cancer rates, or infant mortality, or osteoporosis, the default is always to attribute that to genetics versus sort of lived experience and racism, and we live in an age of genetics, or soon to be AI, maybe. So I'll just give one quick example. Old couple studies that were in Lancet were by an epidemiologist, Bernard Centerwall, and he looked at within family homicides. And the initial kind of data suggested that, oh my God, there's this tremendous difference in homicide rates by race. And then he controlled for residential crowding, and the difference just went away. So it's not genetics, it's lived experience. And so I think that's what we need to sort of separate out. And I'll say one more word. I think we need a different word. We need to abandon using race as a substitute for human genetic variation.
Do you want to weigh in, Jyoti or Angela? I can also, if you prefer a kind of different perspective, what are some of the positive things that at least you try to keep in mind as you're reporting on race? Like, what are some of the ways that you avoid some of these traps or pitfalls?
I think I'm glad you phrased it that way, because I think one of the positive changes I'm seeing now is that more and more when people are covering health and health disparities in particular, instead of just assuming there's a biological difference based on race or ethnicity, there's more and more science news coverage that talks about racism, at least in passing, and will usually include a brief quote somewhere saying race is not biology. But it doesn't really go beyond that. And I think what I'd love to see a little bit more of is for all of us to push it a bit harder and focus on how racism caused the health disparities we're seeing, and sort of science's contributions to that racism.
Well, I would just add, so I've been writing about this issue for a long time, and it's forced me, because I also write about gender, it has forced me to ask myself, why is it that researchers categorize in the first place? What purpose does classification serve? And it's become almost a mantra, I think, in research to collect data, almost as if we have more data, then we will somehow solve all the problems that we have, we will fix all the disparities that we see. And I'm not entirely sure that that's true, because sometimes you collect data and it forces you to look for comparisons, and then it ends there, because how you explain those comparisons, that's the fraught bit. That's where genetics might get invoked, or innate biology, when there could be lots of other factors, as Alan was saying. There are a multitude of social determinants of health, for instance, that explain racial disparities in health. So I would go, and this is what I often say in my talks now, is why don't you just go one leap further and say, in whichever context you're using race, just ask yourself why you're using it at all. And if you're using it as a proxy for something else, just look at that thing that you're using it as a proxy for, whether it's where you live or diet or whatever else it is. Don't be so lazy as to just assume race is a catch-all for everything you're trying to explain.
I wonder if you could talk about, and this is again to the entire panel, the importance of historical context when we're writing about, talking about, reporting on race. I know personally for the piece that I contributed to the Long Division Project, I felt like it was kind of centered in the present day, but I felt like I couldn't write it without going really deep into the history books, right? Yeah. But there's also can be a certain pressure to kind of judge and assess, modern day science on its own terms. So I wonder how you navigate that balance and how you grapple with it in your writing.
Yeah, it's impossible to look at this issue without understanding the history of it, and it's a living history. We see it all the way through the way research is done now. As Jyoti was saying, modern day science just builds on the science that went before, and so on, all the way back to the Enlightenment. And so that's often where you end up. You end up at the Enlightenment and the invention of these categories in the first place. And that is useful, I think. And I do find that especially younger readers now on social media are fascinated by these histories because they can see them in their everyday lives. For example, in the controversy around statues, should we take down Confederate statues or slaveholder statues? Or in the UK, even talking about individuals like Fisher or Darwin. We had a debate around Darwin. I remember when I was at the Natural History Museum, because he also had a problematic story around race and gender. And that makes history real, I think, for people. So what I often like to do in my reporting is tell that historical story through how we're grappling with it in the present, through monuments or research or whatever it is, or sometimes, family members of these people.
Yeah, I think, again, there's a tension here that I kind of grapple with. And I think, you read Angela's book, and you read Angela's work, and you read some of the articles that were in the series. History all of the ways we describe everything in modern biology has this very, 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 very clear, on the nose history, right? And it is deeply, deeply racist and problematic by virtually every definition. So that is absolutely a part of the vernacular that we're using. I think for me, so I think there's a couple issues that I've seen emerging. I think there's a little bit of a reluctance to engage this history now, again, even from my friends. So we had a conversation with a colleague of ours who talked about students now, right? I remember this, like they talked about teaching notes on the state of Virginia in a race science course, because that's a very fundamental thing to teach, to understand kind of how the idea of race kind of was articulated in the United States context. And there's more and more people kind of refusing to engage that because, right, it doesn't feel good. And so that's something that we really need to push back against. We need to deeply we need to do the opposite. We need to kind of double down and lean into historical context more than ever, but with an eye towards what Alan was talking about, that we can actually build a new science, which we should be, so it's like you really, really, really lean into the past, but in order to generate kind of a new dialogue, which I'm actually hopeful for, but it really does require us to double down on our embrace of kind of the history of these ideas.
Let me bring it into the present. So we're at a moment, and Angela, I think you've written about this in your book, where an explosion of new research in genetics and new techniques in genetics research have really kind of helped to fuel kind of a resurgence of a lot of ideas around race science. And Alan, you smartly talk about, distinguishing between race and genetic variation. But as I wrote about in my piece, even when scientists do that, they often talk about genetic variation in terms that are very closely aligned with race. They may not use the term race, but they will look at European populations and compare those to African populations. And there's an explosion of research looking at genetic variation in these kind of old school categories that in some ways has had problematic outcomes. And so I wonder what you think, to put this again to all of you, is this new wave of genetics kind of complicating the job of stamping out race science and racism? If so, how? And what do we do? Easy question.
I'll just quickly say I should know better, but I'm cautiously optimistic that with more data, we'll even more clearly see that the idea of race needs to be separated from human genetic variation. I mean, there's just no reason to be collecting data by continents anymore and sort of putting that in a table, in a journal. I mean, they're really, somebody please, raise your hand and explain to me why that's useful at any point. No, I just don't get it. Other than that's history, that's what we've always done, and it's to say, I think it's intellectually lazy, and I hope I haven't offended anybody.
Well, there is a tension, I think, within the world of science. Biologists increasingly starting to understand that dividing by race doesn't make any biological sense, but of course it does have social sense, and that's why social scientists still collect this data, and that's why these categories are still on the census forms, because it's impossible to map discrimination otherwise. So that tension, I think, hasn't really been resolved. There are countries, for example, France, that don't collect racial data on citizens precisely because after the civil rights era, all countries around the world face this challenge of how do we now respond to a world in which we don't want to segregate anymore, we don't want to divide up people anymore. So should we keep collecting this data to understand segregation and fix it, or should we stop collecting this data in order to create societies in which race doesn't matter? And different countries have taken different approaches to that. The American approach to collect the data and use it is a good one in terms of mapping racism. It's a very bad one in terms of ending racism, because what it creates is it just reinforces the categories. You create new categories all the time. And also, it reinforces in the public imagination and in the imagination of scientists that these categories matter. And I don't really know how to fix that, because how do you map discrimination without also falling into that trap? I don't know.
The quick thing I'll add is something I saw from Eric Turkheimer, a popular behavioral geneticist who I think comes out on the right side of these issues. I mean, as a practicing geneticist, and he said something very, I thought, insightful. He said, like, race scientists and a lot of people think that the modern era of genetics is going to turn the social sciences into a hard science, but really what it's going to do is turn the science of genetics into a social science, right? It's actually going to reveal all of these things about the way, right, the way society and context and history and lived experience are actually informing, right? And this is somebody like me who is on the genetic side, okay? Like, we actually, at the end of the day, I think this technology will do a lot of great things for humanity, and it has the potential to. But I think it's going to take a perspective shift in order for that to happen.
Angela, in your remarks, you mentioned academic freedom, which is one of those phrases that comes up. A lot of times, it's one of those phrases that ends these conversations about race. It's kind of a conversation stopper that people throw out there. I think you smartly point out that academic freedom, at least in design, is supposed to come with responsibility, right? I wonder, and I'll put this to all of you, what are the responsibilities that should come with academic freedom? And as journalists, when scientists pull the academic freedom card, what are some of the ways that we can kind of keep pushing past that and kind of be smart with not letting the conversation in there?
It's a really hard one. I think there was a piece in the New York Times just recently about a scholar somewhere who was just spouting pseudoscience in her classes. I'm sorry, I can't remember her name, but there was nothing they could, Amy Waxman, yeah, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. And she was almost allowed to do that. So I would think the minimum standard is that you are accurate. But even that doesn't seem to be enough of a bar anymore. You don't even have to be accurate or right anymore, scientifically correct anymore. You can say whatever you want. And that does force a really fundamental question, because of course it not only perpetuates these mythologies, but it also undermines public trust in science. If you know that once someone has a tenured position, they can say whatever they want and it doesn't matter if it's truthful or not, then how is the public supposed to trust scientists or academics anymore? And for the life of me, I can't understand why we haven't looked at that more deeply, why academic freedom or freedom of speech is so sacrosanct that you should be allowed to just spout misinformation under that banner.
Is that something any of the other panelists? I know, Brandon, you mentioned academic freedom in one of the early drafts of your piece. I think I cut it out of the final piece.
Good job. Thank you. Glad you did. Well, I think this is a personal one for me because I'm a junior academic, right? So I actually deal with this, in my daily life. And yeah, I mean, what I will say is, I think oddly, Angela, and I think you know this, but like those are like a slight twist on those arguments that you just offered that I agree with are the exact ones being offered for the ending of tenure in Texas. That's precisely what they're saying. They're like, why is tenure sacrosanct? Taxpayer money shouldn't be paying for this. And invariably, there are people who I like who also say pretty crazy and wrong things. Right? And these are the cases that are being brought to kind of end tenure, right, in public institutions. So I think it is actually a much more complicated landscape than I think, right? Then I think maybe it's not as simple as we have to make sure that race science, we should, of course I want them to all to be fired, but there are also people who I like, who've also said pretty incorrect and wild things, and I want them to be able to keep their jobs because they've done a lot of good things. So it's actually pretty complicated, and I don't have like you, I'm gonna punt on a solution. So I don't know.
I just want to say something. Maybe the opposite of academic freedom is self-censorship, which I think is an equally big problem. And I just want to kind of congratulate Brandon for kind of, pre-tenure not censoring himself, or I think you're not censoring yourself and speaking your mind. And, at, risk of a scientist who might be seen as going outside their lane.
So when I was working on my piece for the Long Division Project, I covered a bit of the Buffalo shooting, and I went deep into a lot of the documentation and reporting for that. I spent a lot of time on 4chan and kind of in seedy corners of the internet, reading really atrocious writing and hateful writing. And it was difficult, right? Like afterward, I needed some time to get myself back up. For those of you who are writing about race and racism and topics that are just often psychologically difficult, personal, do you find it taxing in those ways, and how do you handle that? And also, how do you handle it when the trolls come out? Because frankly, a lot of times, you hit publish, and then you get this other barrage, right? How has that been for you, and how do you handle it as writers and journalists?
I think it is, it's like, it does take a toll when you're doing the reporting, for sure. I found it emotionally difficult because it is tough to hear about how much harm people have experienced, especially when you're listening to the stories of people who've been denied care over and over for decades because of their race. But that's sort of on the reporting and writing side of things, and I think that's part of the job, our job in holding science accountable for it. In terms of the trolling, I've been fairly lucky. I've had some angry emails and messages, and that's kind of nothing too terrible.
I'm
sorry.
Yeah, because maybe I'm more senior, my story is a little bit longer, so I'll try to be quick. In 1971, I was an undergraduate, and my first big paper was a brilliant takedown of Arthur Jensen's piece in the Harvard Ed Review. But then I didn't write about race for 20 plus years, and that's why I am congratulating Brandon for having the courage to do so. And my advisor simply told me, no, you're a scientist, don't go there. But 20 years later, the only people writing about race in my discipline were basically African-American biological anthropologists. And so, using my, white skin privilege, I jumped in. And yeah, I've been attacked, through the years, but thankfully never with knives or guns, but lots of words. And yeah, and it's hard, but I think, all of us have, racism is all of our problems. So, that's where I stand.
Well, I left Twitter a few years ago for this reason, which turned out to be the right decision, I think, and Facebook before that. And I do still, there are a number of white supremacists who still kind of write articles about me occasionally online, but I just don't respond. The best thing to do in these situations is not to engage, and that's what I would encourage you all, if you are being treated this way, is because it just gives them more fuel, and it heightens their exposure rather than really dealing with the issue. But I think what's the more terrifying thing as a freelancer is that you worry about reputational damage. I was just doing an event recently with Jane Chu, the brilliant journalist from China who's been widely recognized for her work on COVID-19, the lab leak theory. She has faced horrific abuse over the last few years, sometimes from her colleagues, journalist colleagues, because she has covered this topic, and they thought that she couldn't be fair because she was Chinese, which is just really despicable. She is such a thorough, careful writer and such a brilliant journalist, and how horrific to face abuse from people who, you know, should be congratulating you for your work because of your ethnic origin, to failing to trust you because of your ethnic origin. And I think that's still an issue in journalism in the West, is that some people are trusted with stories more than others because of their ethnicity. And we really need to get over that. Well, you know, sometimes I'm still accused of not being able to write about race fairly because of my skin color, as though white people are able to write about race completely fairly, of course.
Brandon, you just don't let it get to you.
Oh, I mean, you know, I'm weird. I mean, optimism is the wrong word. I just considered, you know, myself in the, you know, this is just another phase in the African American tradition, and like what I'm going through and what we're going through in history is not worse than we went through in the Civil Rights Movement, and certainly isn't worse than what we went through in Reconstruction. This is just another battle, so I don't have a right to be afraid or scared. I have enormous privileges relative to people a generation before me, and so let's use them and do something about it. It doesn't mean I'm not annoyed or frightened or scared, and sometimes, but overall, I mean, this is the story of America and the world, and I'm just another generation born to do the same. So I'm not nearly courageous enough. I don't do nearly as well as my ancestors did, but I try not to be an embarrassment to them, and I think that guides my participation in this.
I've been using a lot of moderator's privilege. I'm going to give some of that up to the audience now, and we can open up for questions. I think we can get a mic going around.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Right here up front.
Hi. You know, it's not just breast cancer that's overlooked. It's osteoporosis, it's skin issues, et cetera. And I just remember when the bell curve came out, I was really disappointed at the sort of chicken thing that scientists lacked in terms of responding until Jay Gould came out with Measure of Man. So I do have some affection for him. But just as an African American sitting here, listening to what we still seem to be dealing with, I don't know whether it's because of the history of racism and maybe some white people are in our blood genes, but it seems like as a people, we're still looking for validation from white people in terms of our existence, and that we want their approval to be here. And what I'm wondering is there a way that we can just say, forget you, white man, we don't care what you think about anything, and in the meantime, getting a whole bunch of black folks becoming doctors so that we can at least help ourselves survive. In other words, if we're doing things to make our own money, who cares about what they say? If we're doing things about helping us live, who cares about what they think? Is that just being completely silly? I get tired of talking about what white people think about me. I don't care. Mm-hmm. I mean, I really don't. I've gotten to that age point that I don't care. Anyway, that's just my little minor comment.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for this panel. I'm I'm a local reporter, and during COVID especially, I've done a lot of reporting with an eye towards covering inequality and inequities around COVID rates, COVID vaccine acceptance, all sorts of things. And I'm often assigned a story to look at racial inequality. And now I'm sort of second guessing a lot of those stories, and I'm wondering what guidance, suggestions you all might have, what traps I might be falling into, number one, with well-meaning intention, but not realizing that I'm sort of falling into exactly what you guys are suggesting. You know, what should we be looking out for when we're trying to cover these issues because we want to cover racism, but end up just feeding into the same problem?
Mm-hmm. Feel free to dive in. I said, anyone feel free to jump in.
So Just briefly, I think one of the things that I like to think about when I'm going into these stories, if I'm reporting on a paper that includes racial categories, I often find researchers and in general broadly, it's like this thing of they say they ask their study participants how they identified race, and if they say it's self-identified, it's like this gold standard. Oh, they told us their race, so we're okay using that category. And I think we have to go a step beyond that. When it comes to reporting on communities, if you're reporting on the harms to a community, like coming back to breast cancer, osteoporosis, and really pretty much every disease, there are these racial disparities. Instead of saying the Black community experiences higher rates of these disease, what are the forces driving those higher rates of disease? It has nothing to do with those people being Black, and it has everything to do with discrimination against certain communities or the places they live in. So I think highlighting those forces can go one step towards that. Definitely centering the voices of the people who are both affected by the problem as well as those working to resolve the problem. One of the gut checks I do when I'm doing these stories is making sure that I'm not just including the person of color as the patient or the victim of circumstance, but they're also the researchers or the policymakers working to address the problem, so that the story itself is not racially divided, even though the issue might be.
I'm part of, I think the issue may be that it's easier to talk about racial differences than the processes, racism. I, for years, used, and I still use, the lived experience of race. But what do I really mean by that? And, that's kind of gloss for racism. And I don't know about other people, but I think that's a place where, it ruffles feathers to talk about racism versus race. And, that's why finally, in 2021, I wrote a book called Racism, Not Race. And I do think we have to lower the sensitivity to talking about racism.
Question on the far side of the room.
Hi there. I was just wondering if, in your reporting and in your mind, if other reporters should seek to further educate people about the requirement of governments around the planet to maintain a racial identification of indigenous populations, for reasons of land, basically. That has to be maintained, and descendancy maintained also. And I ask that as I'm a member of the Navajo tribe here in the United States, and I'm designated a full-blood member of the tribe by the U.S. Bureau of Indian Affairs.
I can take that just because this is something I'm looking at the moment. There's an interesting book that was written last year by David Bernstein, who's a legal scholar, called Classified, where he looks at the post-World War II or post-Civil Rights era regime of classification in the United States and the invention of certain categories and how those categories have been decided and policed. I mean, there was a period in the 1970s where after the label Hispanic was created, that to decide whether you were Hispanic or not was just decided on your surname. That was it, which meant that if you married someone with a Hispanic surname and changed your name, you would be Hispanic after that. So it has been sometimes quite absurd, and you're right that the ways in which ancestry or heritage are decided can seem bizarre and very racist, especially when you're looking at blood quanta in the same way that, there's one drop of blood rule used to in the past. But in a society in which these things are still relevant because the historic injustices haven't been addressed, I don't really see any way beyond it. So no one can resolve this. The Census Bureau can't resolve it. Nobody knows how, a better system. They keep updating the system depending on how things change. And of course, over time, it gets more complicated because it's the mixed box that is the fastest growing box in being ticked on the census forms in the US. And, you know, in 100 years, how do you fix this? But I don't really, you know, until, until that historic injustice of this being a colonial nation have been resolved, then, you know, how do you resolve the ongoing injustice of categorization?
Yes.
Sure. A comment on a trap and an escape from a trap. The panel did a great job of taking us into perennial points in a debate that we often don't escape from. I'm thinking back to my childhood, interviewing for a job at the University of Virginia at the Boar's Head Inn, where explicitly racist genetic theories were advanced. And I won't even repeat them to dignify them. And obviously it was an unsuccessful job interview. I go to Princeton and there's Ashley Montague. And dinner with him was a little different from lunch at the Boar's Head Inn. Now what's the escape from these positions that we keep seeing again and again and again now in social media? And Alan, I think your observation on genomics versus lived experience, but linked to something else, might help. Peter Gallison, the historian of technology at Harvard, often argues that the tools that we have account for the changes in our understandings. And if we look at genomics, the advances in sequencing there, and frankly in genetic experimentation, are phenomenal. And there's no reason to believe that as you go from generalizations about humans to individuals, so popular in discussions, we'll stop at the individual or at the, but it's not going to stop at race. So many other subcategories are going to emerge as being significant in terms of therapy, in terms of accounting for differences. And I'm optimistic, share optimism for once, Alan, with you, in terms of genomics as currently understood with the data sets that are currently being developed will maybe take us beyond these crude racial categories. On the other hand, your reference to lived experience. Lived experience means what? Common experiences. And there, because society is itself racist, we do see common elements in lived experience. Here, again, technology. But we live here at MIT, we have CSAIL, we have our AI guys. And in fact, the application and uses of machine learning and let's call it algorithmic bias that emerges from it, is often the crystallization of lived experience. And race will not disappear from what emerges from the applications of AI. But it's not as if this is going to be static. I think we're going to be seeing changes, improved understandings for the good. And then comes the critical question, what's socially acceptable or academically acceptable or not? And over time, I think that maybe some of the sensitivities will erode if the applications of what we learn are in fact benevolent, have therapeutic value, or have value in terms of improving treatments or public policies. But it's too long an observation. I apologize for taking everyone back to the Boar's Head Inn at the University of Virginia. And anyone who wants to hear what they said, we can do that in private.
Over there.
Hi, I'm Abdullahi, student at graduate program in science writing MIT. I guess my first question goes to Joyty and Angela. Last year, I was approached by an editor at Nature to write a piece on the special issue on racism in science. And as a freelancer and as an early career science journalist, one of the biggest hurdles I faced reporting that piece was, first of all, finding someone who will tell me about their experiences of racism. And that was a lot of trouble. And I reached out to some of the scientists that I know, and they're like, well, I've had experiences, but I'm sorry, I can't talk to you. They're both afraid of, they're afraid of the backlash, because also at the same time, as we all know, it's not easy to talk about your experience as an early career researcher. But I finally found someone who spoke to me and told me about their experiences, and I was able to write that piece. I guess my first question is, for early career science journalists who want to go into reporting about racism and science, how can they do that, and how can they navigate, reporting this bit? You are both established science journalists, and even though you mentioned about some horrible experiences, but I guess you are in such a position that you can be able to not absorb, but I mean, take up some of these consequences that come as a result of the piece that you write. And my second question, Brandon, I think saying that I admire your courage is an understatement, but I like the fact that you also acknowledge that you are in a privileged position such that you can write about these issues. From my experience, trying to get scientists to talk to me, it's very difficult. What advice, I guess, or what will you have to say to African scientists who are working globally and they are experiencing racism, but they are afraid to lose their funding because their research is being funded by international donors and they don't want to talk about these experiences?
It is a really difficult problem trying to get people to talk about their experiences, and I've seen it on the side of both racism and sexism. Last year I was giving a talk at the Max Planck Institute in Dresden, and I was told it would just be a talk, and then afterwards, can you meet with a few of our researchers who requested to see you? And that time afterwards, which was the whole afternoon essentially, was one after another, these one-on-one sessions, which essentially, they were treating me like a therapist, telling me about their experiences of racism and sexism in that institute, which was just awful. I mean, I don't ever want to go back there. It was that bad. And I couldn't do anything about it. That was I was their sounding box, them knowing that I wasn't able to say anything because it was all off the record, and yet them also knowing that they wouldn't do nothing about what they'd told me afterwards. And that is the frustration here, is that I get lots of emails all the time from people who are suffering harassment, abuse, discrimination, and are not willing to go on the record, not able to go on the record, and yet have no other way out. Sometimes they leave their jobs altogether, and that is really heartbreaking, because it's hard enough in the sciences to get as far as they have. One way around it I have found is just by, when I do these pieces, to just anonymize people, so at least I can write about it for the public. It doesn't fix their individual issues, though. I do, one thing we could do as science journalists is perhaps hold institutions to account better on how they have procedures in place in order to allow people a space to go to when they have these problems, and not have to turn to people like me out of desperation. So that might be, a possible strand of reporting that we haven't looked at heavily enough, is to what extent are universities and scientific institutions dealing with complaints and issues of harassment.
Thank you. I think I'll add, just to build off of what Angela was saying, it's something that comes up with race, it's also something that comes up with gender, and really anytime someone has experienced discrimination in some form because of a system that also has the power to hurt them further, it is difficult for them to speak up. And as a freelancer, I don't think of myself as having a lot of privilege in the journalism space, but I do think in cases like this, it is important for me personally. What I try to do is engage in a conversation with my editor, even if they say editors don't like anonymous sources, we like having faces and rich stories, etc. But these are instances where there are real people at stake. It's a privilege, and it's wonderful that they're willing to share that story in hopes of enacting change. And I think as journalists and outlets overall can do a little bit more to respect that. If, for instance, a magazine that's putting a special issue out about racism, they should be willing to protect the victims of that racism at least a little bit. That's one piece of it. The other piece I would say is that even if that doesn't happen, it's worth striving to find those stories, because the individual story is what makes the most impact. It's one thing to say researchers from the Global South don't receive visas as often to go to scientific conferences. It's a whole other thing to tell the story of a researcher whose career has been significantly impacted because of that overall issue. So we do have to keep pushing for those stories, but at the same time, honor our sources.
I think, Phil, thank you for the question with regards to how to talk to scientists about this. And I think I have not done that from the journalist chair, but I have done it from an analogous chair, in particular because me being a PI and just how international this has really radicalized me with regards to, immigration as a whole. And in particular, it's taught me a lot about how to talk to people from around the world about their experiences and about their pain. And I've learned a lot of things. I mean, I have a vernacular that I use and a vocabulary that I've been raised with to talk about race, right? I mean, it's probably like the first complex thing I thought about, right, as a child. But what I've learned is scientists from different parts of Africa, scientists from Asia, getting them to talk about their pain is very hard to begin with. And in part because it's just not, oftentimes you find, number one, like the culture, there's just a thing about talking a complaint, right? I think that is just different than my American. I'm very, very comfortable complaining. It's just kind of how I was raised. I have a whole thing, but it's just not the way some people are, particularly when it comes to these very sensitive jobs that and their experiences about home. I think the key thing that I've learned is understand how they think about their difference and talk about it on their terms, right? So I can't walk my very, very American view of race and racism, right, and expect everyone to understand it. They have a pain of their own. They have a way to describe it. And it is my responsibility to learn what that vocabulary is and talk about it on their terms. And I think that's been I've been much more successful getting to their experience with the racism that way than my kind of very, very, very American, I love my perspective on it, but it is one perspective on race. And it's an important one, and I think the African American experience has taught the world a lot about race, but it is still one way of thinking about identity, right? So I think I've had a lot more success diversifying and being more agile with regards to language. And I think that's how you actually talk to scientists around the world who are dealing with different stressors.
We had a question in the back.
Yes, thank you so much for this fantastic panel and the amazing package you all put together. I've just been thinking about another way that science and pseudoscience is being used to oppress a particular group, and this is with respect to trans people. I think this is a topic that many newsrooms are struggling to get right and maybe perpetuating harms as a result. And so just wondering if there's anything that you all have learned from your deep reporting and research into the history of race science that can be applied to our coverage of the trans community.
I can talk about that. So my latest book is on gender and patriarchy, and I've given a number of interviews recently about how, again, coming back to categorization, how these very rigid categories have been used to put, very firm ideas about masculinity and femininity around us that naturally exclude many of us, and not just trans and intersex people, but also many of us who don't conform to those stereotypes, who don't fit into those boxes comfortably. And this is a particular artifact of modern Western science. These ideas don't exist in the same way all over the world. Of course, in India, where I used to work, that's where I had my first job, the government introduced a third gender category. There has always been acknowledgement of transgender people, not always in a comfortable way and not always in a respectful way, but at least an acknowledgement. So I do think that cross-cultural perspective is a very useful one when we think about gender and thinking beyond the binary within the sciences, but also as reporters. And it's just as useful in race, of course, because the racial categories used in the US are not universal either. They're very different categories depending on in other countries. And the meaning of those categories are different. I mean, I was, I was surprised looking at the data around COVID-19 in the UK, Indian American, which is my heritage, so I would tick the Indian box. In the UK, I belong to a demographic which did very badly out of COVID-19, very high death rates and critical illness. In the US, Asian Americans, because you have a much broader way of defining that group that I belong to, where I have heritage, did the best. So just by moving to this country, I'm in a completely different socioeconomic category, and my life expectancy has gone up suddenly, very suddenly. But that's how these categories work. They're social categories, and they only have particular meaning depending on where and when you are. And again, I think that cross-cultural and cross-time perspective is so useful as reporters to also think about the transgender issue.
A question up front.
Thanks. I just wanted to sort of quick response to the question that Abdullahi you raised at the back, and I think JLT you also commented on, which is the responsibility of editors and publishers when particularly early career or younger newer reporters are covering these topics. And I think we're on a, you know, again as an editor myself, I think we're on a real learning journey ourselves in this. This is a relatively new territory, and I think one of the constraints that we find is also it's the nature of journalism itself and the way in which we do journalism training. So when we go out and talk to our sources, there's very little differentiation between types of sources. And you're always the objective onlooker, and your source is generally in the sort of power balance lower than you. And it's the way in which our field, our profession has operated. Now, we sometimes call it objectivity, detachment, what have you. And I remember doing an interview with a community affairs, this is a bit of a shout out for local journalism, a community affairs correspondent in the Netherlands, who said, if we think of our sources as our readers, it changes our relationship to them. They're no longer people that we're objectifying, but they are part of us. And, you know, then your point, JLT, about, you know, then thinking about the responsibility of your role as a reporter then starts to become a much bigger, you know, sort of part of the equation. And I don't think we've quite figured that out, whether it's in science reporting or in general reporting. I still think there's very much an outsider-insider issue that's sort of going on. One very quick comment about, so I work for Nature, and we often get a lot of correspondence in response to the journalism that we do, and we often get a lot of scientists writing in on stories around race saying, like, why are you dredging up the past? This is sort of kind of, you know, we're all about the future. It's about positivity, and yes, you know, we're over this. And one response that my colleagues have sort of started to formulate is that, you know, within, you know, what is the medium of communication in science is the paper. And within the paper, one of the most important aspects is the citation list, you know, is the reference list. And if you've got a dodgy reference list, your paper's effectively, you know, a bit of a dud, or it's questionable. And so going into the past, going into history, is fixing your reference list. It's fixing your citation list. And that, you know, I think for a lot of, particularly, dare I say, natural scientists, engineers, technologists who don't quite get the social science dimension, we're starting to use that argument in response.
I think we could talk about this for days, and we should continue doing it, but we're going to have to close this out now. Let's give a round of applause to this amazing panel. We have about 15 minutes if you want to get up and stretch before our final keynote with Charles Blow. So we'll see you back here shortly.